In the Bible, the Apostle Paul talks about the importance of both spiritual training and physical training. And I would have said that I agreed, but for a very long time, my life told a very different story. I was not physically active in terms of working out, lifting weights, running, anything like that. Every once in a while, I would have these bouts with a treadmill, or there was this time in my 20s where I purchased a set of Tybo VHS tapes, and that lasted for literally about 3 days before I stopped. But I would have said like, oh yeah, I can run if I need to. I can lift something heavy if I need to. I would even make this joke of like, well, I could run if I was being chased. And then over the years, that joke turned into, but I might just let them catch me. It might not be worth it to run. And spiritually, it was very similar. You know, I had seasons of church attendance, seasons of involvement with one religious group or another. I did the pray and point method of discerning God's will, where you pray and then you just kind of point and then that's your answer. But it wasn't effective. But I told myself, well, it didn't really matter because God knows my heart and he knows that I believe in him. So he's fine with not spending any sort of regular time with me. And I think that looking back, I can see how deeply flawed my beliefs about both physical and spiritual training were. And I'm not a professional in either of those realms by any means, but I do want to share some of the things that I've learned. And I think the reason that the Apostle Paul compares the two is because both of them require discipline, both of them require commitment, and there are truths about one that can apply to the other. So it's a beautiful analogy, and we're going to dive into it with a series. So let's go into week 1 of Holy Boot Camp. So here's what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Timothy 4:8. Physical training is good, but training for godliness is much better, promising benefits in this life and in the life to come. So physically, like I said, I would have said that I agreed with the thought that physical training is good, but I never did any sort of physical training whatsoever for a very long time. And what's funny is I genuinely believed that I had strength, that I had stamina, that I could lift something heavy or run if I needed to. I never understood why people said, don't lift with your back, lift with your legs. Didn't know what that meant. But yet I thought that, I don't know, maybe I was going to get like a burst of adrenaline if something happened and I suddenly needed to do something that required this physical feat of strength. And I would say things like, well, I don't want to work out because I don't want to be too bulky. I just want to be toned. That's all. But I had zero idea of how much effort actually goes into toning, which is a lot of work. I don't even think I'm there yet, but I'm working on it now. But I've been fairly active in various stages of my life. I worked in restaurants for many, many years, and that requires you to be on your feet and constantly moving for hours and hours. We lived in Brooklyn for a while, and it was not uncommon for me to walk a couple miles to work and back each day. So I would tell myself, oh, I'm strong enough, I'm healthy enough, everything's fine. But I lacked strength. I lacked real endurance and stamina, and I lacked lung capacity. I didn't know how to breathe correctly whenever I was working out. There was a lot that I didn't know. But then 2020 happened, and like so many other people, everything changed. We moved across the country. I went from working an obscene amount of hours a day to literally just sitting on the couch all day. We had a house with space, so I had the space to work out, I had the time to work out, and I had zero excuses. So I started working out. I'll share with you in just a second what that looked like. But now I work out typically 5 to 6 days a week. I actually enjoy working out. I look forward to it a lot of the time, not all the time, because sometimes I know what's coming and I don't like it. Taking care of my body physically is actually one of the best gifts that I've ever given to myself. And I have a long way to go, but I have come a really long way. And it's funny when I look back and think about all of the excuses I made for why I shouldn't do it. Really, my only regret is not having started sooner. And honestly, spiritual training is really similar. I think that too often we make excuses for ourselves. We ask ourselves just to do the absolute bare minimum. Maybe you pray before meals and you feel like that's the sufficient amount of time to pray, or you pray at bedtime. Maybe you attend church weekly, or maybe you're really, really holy and you go to church multiple times a week, and that's the extent of the time that you need to spend with God. Maybe that's the extent of the times that you hear scripture at all. And you think, well, that's fine. I'm just doing the bare minimum. This is all that God needs from me. This is all that he's asked of me. Well, God doesn't really need anything from us, but what if he wants so much more than we are so often willing to give? What if he wants our entire lives? And what would that even look like to have a life that was fully dedicated to God, poured out to him day in and day out? I think it would look like Daniel. So Daniel was one of the 4 Hebrew boys that we read about in the book aptly named Daniel. So the other 3 Hebrew boys you've heard of, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, because they have their own fame in being thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel actually does some incredible works for God in this book, but there's one that you've probably heard about if you were raised in church all the way back to Sunday school, which is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. And that's the one that I want to chat about briefly today. So here's the story. It comes out of Daniel chapter 6. So Daniel had been given great favor with the king of Babylon. He had actually been appointed to a very high role, and he was able to help rule Babylon. Well, that made a lot of other people jealous, and they wanted to find an excuse to assassinate Daniel's character. So they searched for all of these different potential faults that he could have, that they could bring against him, that they could bring to the king as proof of why Daniel needed to be disposed of. But they couldn't find anything because Daniel was so upright. So here's what they said in verse 5. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the only fault that they could find with Daniel is if they accused him of something related to him following God. So here's what they did. They went to the king, and in verse 7, this is what they said. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. So the king, of course, makes a wise decision and says, yep, sounds great. No worries. Doesn't think at all about any potential repercussions of this, and so he signs it into law. So here's what happens next. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with its windows open toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, well, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of his predicament. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of his nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, Long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Wow. I love that story so much. I love the way that Daniel was committed to God, and I love the fact that the king had such a high regard for Daniel that he praised God as a result too. And it's funny because the law was that nobody could pray or praise, right, to anybody other than the king. And here the king is actually giving glory to God because of what he had done. Absolutely incredible story. But what's interesting is I think a lot of us who would call ourselves Christians, we would say that we follow God, but we don't spend the amount of time with him that Daniel did in this instance. But yet we think that if we were in Daniel's place, that we would have done the same thing, that we would have boldly gone to the lion's den. But whenever we are faced with challenges in our lives, do we do the same thing? I kind of think that what we would have done instead if we were Daniel is we would have gone and said, okay, well, I'm going to keep praying, but I'm going to shut my windows and not pray toward Jerusalem, which was what he was supposed to have been doing in this time. That's not something that we're still required to do today, but that is something that Daniel would have done out of a deep commitment to his faith at that time. We would have made an excuse and we would have said, well, I'm still going to pray. I'm just going to shut the windows. Or I'm not going to pray aloud. I'm just going to pray in my heart because they can't take that away from me. And that's how I'm going to stand firm and buck the system. Or we would justify our disobedience completely by saying, well, this law is only for 30 days. I could just take a month off of praying. God understands. He wants me alive. I'm not going to be able to do him any good if I'm torn apart by lions. So therefore, I'm just not going to pray for 30 days. And then on day 31, I'll come back and I'll talk to God and he'll understand because he knows my heart, right? But if we aren't spending time with God regularly now, how are we actually going to fare when a challenge comes in our lives, when a trial comes, when we face this crisis of faith? Are we really going to be able to stand strong? Are we really going to have the confidence to go to the lion's den because we know that we've been found innocent in our God's eyes? Or are we just going to make excuses for our disobedience? And it's a lot like physical training, right? You can't just jump up and go run a marathon right now. You've got to train for it. You've got to plan for it. Life is a series of spiritual marathons that we have to run. And have we trained for them? Have we prepared for them? So how do we do that? How do we get in spiritual shape now so that when we face a spiritual marathon or a holy weightlifting competition, we're able to step up and actually stay strong? What do we do? So what did Daniel do? Well, if you start in Daniel 1 and you read on, we see a lot of really incredible things about Daniel's relationship with God that we can model ourselves after in many ways. For one thing, Daniel's really intentional in what he eats, and that's a video in a couple weeks that we'll talk about. Daniel also has a lot of God-given abilities and favor with leadership and government authorities, and so he actually is able to glorify God in the marketplace and the workplace and stand up for God and glorify him and do a lot of incredible stuff that way. But I think all of that stems from what we see even in this passage, which is that Daniel had a daily commitment to God, that 3 times a day he stopped everything he was doing and spent time alone with God. But this has to start somewhere. How do we get started? How do we build this habit of spending time alone with God? Can you just jump in 3 times a week, stopping everything? You could try it. I think a lot of times we burn ourselves out because we try to do too much. My suggestion is start small. Just focus on building a habit of spending time with God. Physically, I'll tell you what this looked like for me because I think there's a lot of parallels. So I knew that I was going to start working out and I didn't know where to start, but I thought, I think I might like some sort of dance cardio. Not super coordinated, but I kind of enjoy it. So what I did was I went online, I found a video on YouTube. It was a 15-minute, super easy dance cardio workout. And so every day for a week, I put on workout clothes, I went down to our basement and I did this 15-minute dance cardio workout. It was super simple. I did it every single day, the exact same video. And then the next week I was like, okay, I did 1 week down. I'm going to do it again, but I'm going to find a 20-minute video and I'm going to do the same thing. And so I found a 20-minute dance cardio video, did it every day for a week. And then I did it for another week. And then I started trying out trials of other companies and places that had programs. And I would do it every day for a week. I would try this one. And then I realized cardio boxing was kind of fun. So I would start trying out that. And now I have discovered that I like lifting weights. I like things that require me to lift heavy. I don't like cardio near as much, but I am trying to have a love relationship with it. It's just more love-hate. But it's taken me a long time to get there. And it all started with just making a commitment to every single day show up and do something. I had to start there because if I had jumped straight in to going to lifting too hard or pushing myself too strong, I probably would have burned out. I would have gotten discouraged. I would have said, oh, I can't lift this or I can't do this. And I would have given up. I had to start simple. I had to start easy. I had to start daily. So I want to propose the same thing for spiritual training. In the next video, I want to share some practical things that you can do during your quiet time. I call it quiet time. Some people call it devotional time or Bible time or God time, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. I call it quiet time. I don't know why. Somebody called it that way, I guess, and I picked it up and it just stuck with me. But I'll share some practical things. But for you, what is it that you like? What is it about the Christian faith that appeals to you the most? Start there and start small, but commit to doing it every single day. So maybe you really like the Psalms. Maybe pick one Psalm every day, and every day you sit, you read one Psalm, and you sit for like 5 minutes and just think about it, pray about it, stay in silence, let God speak to you. Maybe you're into worship music, and for you, it could be picking a worship song, reading through the lyrics, praying through the lyrics, and just listening to that song, meditating on that song and what that means for you. Maybe it's nature. Maybe you're a nature person. Maybe it's going out somewhere into nature and sitting and listening to God and admiring his craftsmanship, admiring the world that he created, and just doing it for a short amount of time, but doing it every single day. Or maybe you really like stories that they talk about in Sunday school, stories like Daniel in the lion's den or these 3 boys in the fiery furnace. Maybe you get a lot of encouragement from them and you really just enjoy reading them. Honestly, maybe it's going and buying a children's Bible storybook and just reading that every single day, one story every single day. Whatever it looks like, start with what you're interested in and commit to doing it every single day. I guarantee you God will show up. I guarantee you that he will speak to you. Money back a guarantee. He will speak something to you. He will show you something. He will open your eyes to something. So I encourage you for the next week, set a timer, set a time, go out, do something, begin to build that habit. So final thought, does it matter if you're spending time regularly with God? Again, look at Daniel. He was known for spending time with God. He had God-given abilities. He had the ability to prophesy, the ability to interpret dreams. He had leadership capabilities. He was effective for God because he spent time with God. And because he was effective for God, that's why his enemies came to accuse him. We do have an enemy. It's not a human like Daniel had, but it's Satan. It's the accuser. It's our adversary. 1 Peter 5:8 tells us that he is prowling like a lion, looking for someone to devour. And if he's not coming at you, if he's not trying to lure you into his den, maybe it's because you're not a threat. You're not a spiritual threat. You're not as effective as you could be because you're not spending time regularly with God. Daniel's enemies knew that he prayed 3 times a day. They knew that he was faithful to God. They knew that the only way that they could ever come against him was to try to interfere with that relationship between Daniel and the Lord. They weren't successful, but they knew that that was their only opportunity. And the king knew that Daniel served God faithfully. He wanted him to succeed for that reason, and he wanted God to deliver him. Does the enemy see you as a threat? How hard would it be for him to interfere with that relationship with you and God? Would it be a struggle, or would it be adding a little extra chaos to your life? Maybe a little distraction with TV or social media or phone games. Maybe it's a little more stress at work or a little more stress at home. Is it that easy for him to divide your relationship with God? And I'm not saying that that should be our motivation in seeking God, but what I am saying is if we want to be as effective for God as humanly possible, as supernaturally possible, we have to be spending time regularly with him. And like I said, I'm not a spiritual professional. I'm not a physical professional. Even this morning, there are things that God was bringing to mind that I need to be focusing on. I have plenty of room to grow, but let's commit for the next week to begin to build the habit by dedicating time every single day with God. Let's be like Daniel. Let's be known for the time that we've spent with the Lord. And then please come back next week as we talk about some practical things that we can do in that time alone with God.